In this lecture, we want to talk about the regions as well as the so-called availability zones and also how the data centers are fitting into these regions and availability zones. First of all, let's start with the region. This is of course a region on our globe, and this consists of one or multiple data centers within a specific radius. So this can be, for example, West Germany or East US, and in these regions we have different data centers and they are connected via a low latency network. So as mentioned, these regions can be, for example, West Europe, North US, and so on. And we actually deploy the services or the resources into these regions. So usually we try to deploy them close to where the users are, and also the pricing plays a factor. So depending on which region we deploy our service to, we have different pricings. And now we have also in these regions, at least in most of the regions, so-called availability zones. These are supported in most of the regions, but actually not every single region. But most of them do support those availability zones. And the purpose for them is to achieve redundancy in the event of a disaster. We have a better fault tolerance. So if one entire zone is going down, we still have everything synced and we can still have our services up. So this is mainly achieving higher fault tolerance, but also it's affecting higher availability, and even it's increasing the scalability with this model. But this is going too deep. We have enough information if we know this is creating redundancy and it's increasing the fault tolerance. So let's see how this works exactly. If we have one region with availability zones, we have physically separate locations within one region. So this is the availability zone. And here we can see we have one zone with one data center. But this is now actually only one zone and then another availability zone where we have at least one data center, but it can be also many data centers, like 2 or 3 data centers within one availability zone. And now those availability zones are connected through a low latency network. And also they have independent cooling, independent powering, independent networking, so that when one availability zone has some kind of disaster, maybe the entire electricity is going down, there's an earthquake, then everything is synced via this low latency network, and then our service will not be affected and we still have this service available. And actually, if a region has these availability zones supported, then we have at least 3 availability zones per region. So let's quickly summarize what we've learned about the important availability zones. We've learned we have at least 3 availability zones per region that supports the availability zones. And they are connected via a high performance, low latency network with independent power, cooling, and networking infrastructure. And the purpose for those availability zones is to create redundancies. So everything is synced, and then if one location is going down, then we still keep our region up. So the purpose of those is to keep the region up. And this is the highest level that they can protect the regions. They cannot protect if an entire region has a problem. Maybe there's a big earthquake or something. And then, of course, if the entire region is affected or the entire continent, of course, then they cannot help. But they can help in this location. If there is a disaster, then this will prevent that the entire region is going down. This is what we need to know about regions and availability zones. Aside to that, we also have so-called region pairs. That's what we want to talk about in the next lecture. In the previous lecture, we've talked about availability zones and regions. So we've learned that an availability zone can protect an entire region, that this entire region is going down. But what happens if all of the region is going down. That means all of the availability zones are, for example, affected by some kind of huge disaster like earthquakes, hurricanes, or other man-made or natural disasters. We have sometimes applications that also need to be protected, or data that needs to be protected against such disastrous events. In this case, we can replicate the data even across multiple regions. This is then called geo-replication or geo-redundant replication. And this is sometimes also helpful if we, for example, need to apply updates. In this case, we can first apply the update in one region and afterwards we can shift back to the other region. And this can also be applied if we really need a very high availability, because this is increasing our availability of our services and also the reliability. So if we have some super critical applications, services, then we can use geo-redundant replication to increase the high availability and the reliability. But now the question is, how do we choose those regions? There are different factors that play a role if we want to choose which regions do we pair in such a geo-replication. Things can be, of course, like data residency. Maybe there are some regulations, some compliance standards that we need to fulfill and that we need to follow. And also there can be geopolitical situations playing a role. And also, of course, if we have our users mainly, let's say, in North America, internet latency also plays a role. And this is why we have so-called region pairs. These are recommended regions for geo-replication. So this is what is recommended in applications, or the default setting if we choose the geo-replication. So region pairs is some regions that are in a far enough distance, so they are really isolated. Usually this is at least 300 miles. So we have enough redundancy or enough protection so that they are isolated enough. But also at the same time, they are placed in the same so-called geography. This means, what is a geography? This is a discrete market. Usually this is a country, and this is there so that we can maintain data residency and the same compliance standards. So as mentioned, usually these are the countries, so that we have all of these factors still included and we can make sure that we are suddenly not violating any regulations or increasing, for example, geopolitical risks. And some of the examples of the region pairs we can see in here. So we have the geography. For example, we have North America, we have US East, and the region pair is in this case US West. Of course, don't worry, you don't need to know all of these exact pairs. This is not necessary. This is now almost everything that we need to know about the global infrastructure. The last thing is that there are some very special regions that we can also already see here. So we have, for example, US government. And these so-called sovereign regions we now also quickly want to cover in the next lecture before we then dive a little bit deeper into Azure itself. There are some very special regions that we've already seen previously, and these are the so-called sovereign regions. They are completely separate from the cloud. They are physically separated and also not accessible by everyone. So they are completely isolated also physically. We have, for example, the geography US government, and there are a few sovereign regions, like, for example, US Department of Defense Central and a few more regions. Then we also have China. There are also some very special regulations, and therefore there's also a sovereign region, China. And all of these sovereign regions are there just because only like this the very complex regulations or compliance requirements can be fulfilled. So let's first talk about US government. This is the geography in which we have a few sovereign US government regions. it is important that this is completely physically isolated from the main instance. Also, it is not accessible through the standard URL, so portal.azure.com, but through portal.azure.us. And this is created because there was a need for it, but with the public cloud, this could not be fulfilled. So they were very complex compliance standards. Of course, if the Department of Defense wants to use these data centers, this is very complex. So this could only be fulfilled by using the sovereign regions. These can only be used by US government and also their partners, so official partners of the US government. It is applicable and usable both on a state level and on a local government level, including their official partners and contractors. Also, this is only operated by screened US personnel, and additional compliance certificates are necessary there. This is the US government. Then we also have Azure China. It is more complex in general to make business and operate especially data centers in China, and this can only be met by using partners. So they need to have a partner in China that is a local company. So therefore the data centers are not maintained directly by Azure, but by a trusted partner, which is 21 ViaNet. And like this, it is possible to also operate in China. And this is then again accessed through a completely separate instance, which is portal.azure.cn. These are the sovereign regions. And now that we've talked about this global infrastructure, we want to dive a little bit deeper into Azure itself and see how things are organized there on a high level. Now let's talk about the super important topic of resources and resource groups. That's super important for the exam, but also in general for Azure. So a resource is just an instance of a service that we create in the Azure portal, for example. So if we as a company, for example, need a virtual machine or a SQL database, we create a resource out of the service. So for example, a SQL database, and all of the resources we always deploy to a region that we choose. The region, of course, depends on different factors. We've already talked about this. For example, pricing is affected by this. Also, we usually want to deploy these resources close to where our users are so that we have a low latency, but also compliance and regulations can play a role. The resources that we create always need to be in a resource group, and also they can only be part of one resource group. So a resource group is like a folder, basically a logical container that stores the resources. This can be then used as a management layer. So we can configure permissions or delete resources more easily. For example, if we delete the entire resource group, this will delete all of the resources in this resource group. For example, we can have an application that needs a few resources, and once we maybe don't need this application anymore, we can delete the entire resource group. But also we can manage permissions using resource groups. So we can, for example, apply permissions. We'll talk in more detail about permissions later on. And then all of these permissions will be inherited by the resources that are contained in this resource group. Tags is also something we'll talk about later. This is an exception. They are not inherited. For now already, tags are like labels that we can apply, for example, for billing purposes. So we can have a resource group with a tag, and this will not be then inherited to the resources. And we have already said that all of the resources have a region. Also, a resource group has a region. And it's important that the resource group can have a different region than the resources in this group. So they can have completely different regions, and it really doesn't matter. This is completely possible. This is because the resource group only stores the metadata. So it's not actually storing these resources physically, but it's only storing the related metadata. And also it is possible that resources from different resource groups can be connected. So this is not related to the resource groups, but how we configure the resources. So a connection is completely possible and has nothing to do with the resource groups, but only about how we configure the resources. And last but not least, I also want to mention that it is not possible to nest the resource groups. So a resource group is never part of another resource group. This is not possible. And also, I've already mentioned, if we delete the resource group, it will delete all of the resources that are contained in this resource group. These are resources and resource groups. Now let's head over into the Azure portal and see this live in action, how this works in the portal. Now let's have a look at how we can create a resource group and also resources and how they play together. First of all, if we create a resource, this needs to be in a resource group. Therefore, we want to start with creating a resource group. We can find the service resource groups just by searching resource groups, and then we find resource groups. So if I select this, I see in my case that there are already a few resource groups that I've created before. But now if we want to create a new resource group, I can just click here on create. And then I just have to make some very basic configurations to create this resource group. For example, I have to select a subscription. This is just for billing purposes, and we'll talk about the subscriptions also later on. Then I have to give this resource group a name. So for example, I tried to call this our first resource group. Then there will be a quick check on the name if this is possible, and then this is validated. Of course, if I try to use something like, for example, whitespace, this will not work because a whitespace cannot be used in the name. So I remove it and then it works again. Again, a resource group has also a region, but this is not affecting what resources can be stored in this resource group. So I will just leave it at the default US East. We have some additional options like tags. We will talk about them later on, and then we will just be able to create this resource group. So we just click on create, and then this resource group will be created. Now if I have a look, we can search. Here is this resource group, and we can see that currently there are no resources included. But we can create a resource just from here, or if we just go back to the home, we can also just, for example, create a storage account. So let's just create a storage account. I'm searching for storage. I find the service again. I have already some storage accounts created before, and now I can create a new storage account. So this will be now a resource, and we want to store this in our created resource group. So now I can select our first resource group, or even I could create a completely new resource group from here. Then we can again use a name, for example, first storage account. And then again, there will be a check. And in this case, this only can contain lowercase letters. So I would have to adjust it. And then let's use this. And then like this. And then the name will be validated and checked. And now again here, we could use a different region. For example, in here, I could now use US West 2. This is totally possible. Also, here we can see the redundancy. We've also already talked about this. So we have locally redundant, which is the cheapest, and this is just replicating within the data center. So there will be 3 copies of the data. We have geo-redundant, which is replicating across multiple regions. And then also we have zone redundant, which is just replicating across availability zones. But we'll talk about those redundancies later on again. So now if we would like to create this storage account like this, we just click on review, then there will be a quick validation, and afterwards we will be able to create this storage account. Then it will be deployed. It will take a few seconds until it is deployed. And then after just a few seconds, this storage account will be deployed. So if we go back now to the home menu, we can see this usually already here appearing in the top, and also here we find our resource group. And if we go to this resource group, we find now in this resource group our storage account that we have created. We could now, for example, delete it just from here, so we can delete a single resource, or we can also delete the entire resource group. There will be a check, so we have to type the resource name, which I can do, so I just use our first resource group, and there is also one resource in this group that will also be deleted. So this is why we need again this validation that we are really sure that we want to delete this resource group. So I will do this, click on delete, and then this entire group will be deleted, including the resources in this resource group. So this will just take a little time, and then this will be not visible anymore. We've already talked now also about subscriptions, and that's what we now want to dive a little bit deeper into understanding how do these subscriptions fit into the big picture in our Azure account. Let's complete our discussion about the hierarchical structure of our Azure account by talking about subscriptions and management groups. In the top level, we have the Azure account. This is always a Microsoft account that we use to manage our entire account. And there we can have now multiple subscriptions. So our subscription is part of our Azure account, and this is there for billing purposes. And of course, in our subscription, we've learned we can have multiple resource groups, and in these resource groups, we can have our resources. As mentioned, we can have under one account multiple subscriptions. Of course, one subscription cannot be part of additional Azure accounts. So one subscription is always part of one Azure account, but as we can see, one Azure account can have multiple subscriptions. This is possible, and those subscriptions, the main reason for them is for billing purposes. So we have one payment method, and then this will be under one subscription. So for example, the IT department wants to have a separate billing, then this has to be a separate subscription. And it is important that these resources can be migrated or moved to other subscriptions. This is completely possible. We cannot merge subscriptions into one, so this is not possible, but we can shift them from one subscription to another subscription. This is possible. But now sometimes we have the need for an additional management layer. For example, we want to apply different policies to multiple subscriptions, and we want to manage multiple subscriptions all at once. This is when the level of management groups come into play. We can create them, and we can basically combine multiple subscriptions in one management group. So this is an additional management layer, and oftentimes this is used, for example, to apply specific policies. For example, the finance department has very specific policies, or it can be also multiple different countries of the company where different policies apply. They can be then applied on the management group level. And then, of course, below this, we have again our resources as we have seen it before. Now we have remembered that the resource groups cannot be nested. So we cannot have a resource group within another resource group. But this is now possible for the management groups. They can be nested. For example, we can distinguish the IT department further. We have maybe different policies in the data science team and the BI team. And there we can then add additional management groups that are contained in another management group. This is totally possible. So that is what we need to know about the management groups and the subscriptions. Let's quickly summarize the important parts that we've learned. We have at the lowest level, of course, our resources. These are instances of Azure services, for example, databases, virtual machines that the company needs to use. They can be easily moved from one subscription to another subscription if necessary. Then they are always contained in a resource group. This is a logical container that is used to manage our resources. Of course, we remember the region does not need to be the same in the resource group and the contained resources. This is not necessary. And then we have above this the subscriptions. This is what we use for billing purposes. And of course, one account can have multiple subscriptions that are all managed by one Azure account. And also, we have learned the resources can be shifted from one subscription to another one, but we cannot merge these subscriptions. Examples for subscriptions are, for example, different environments. We have test environment, dev environment, and prod environment. So if we want to distinguish the billing, then we can just use different environments. Oftentimes also it is an organizational structure. For example, the IT department or maybe the HR department, they have a separate subscription. But the main reason is usually for billing purposes. This is what we need these subscriptions for. And then if we need an additional layer of management, we can have the management groups. They are there to group multiple subscriptions, and also we can apply, for example, policies in these management groups. And those management groups can be nested. This is the exact hierarchical structure that we find in our Azure account. Let's have a look at the management groups and the subscriptions also in our Azure account. We can again find the management groups if we are just searching for it in this bar. There we see management groups. In my case, I already have this tenant root group visible. In your case, it is also possible that you don't see anything in here, but we can first of all create additional management groups. So you can also, if you want, click here on create, and there we can now provide a management group ID. This is just the hidden ID that is used and cannot be changed afterwards. For example, if I try to use, let's say, IT department, it is not possible because we cannot use those white spaces in the ID. So if I use IT department like this, then it should work. But now if I want to display it like this, IT department like this, then this is possible in the group display name. Now if I submit, this group will be created. It will just take a few seconds, maybe 1 minute, and then this is created. So if I'm refreshing after about maybe 1 minute, I will see this group has been successfully created, and I can now see this group here. If I open this up, I see currently there are no resources and also no other management groups included, but I can now, for example, add a subscription to this management group, but I can also nest further groups in this management group. I can either click here on create new group here, or also the same will happen if I just click here on create, then I can create an additional management group. Maybe now I want to have the BI team being part of this group. So I can use the name BI team, I submit, and then an additional management group, a child management group, will be created that is now part of the IT department management group. And then after about a minute or a few seconds, this will be created. For example, I can now expand the IT department, I can select the BI team, and in here, as mentioned, I can now add a subscription. So if I have already one subscription, I could use this, or if I have multiple subscriptions, I could also just select from them and add them here to this management group. course, also this management group, as mentioned, can be used for management purposes of, for example, applying policies or security configurations, which will all be inherited then to the contained subscriptions, resource groups, and the resources. Also, we can use it for cost management and, for example, see also the resources that are included in this. So you can see this can be a very helpful management layer of our subscription, our resource groups, and our resources. Congratulations on again completing the next module about the infrastructure, the global infrastructure, and the hierarchy in our Azure accounts. That's a very important part, and that's why we now quickly want to summarize what we've learned. If we talk about the global infrastructure, the highest level of the hierarchy are the geographies. These are discrete markets or areas in the world that contain at least one region, and they have the same compliance and the same data residency in common. So they can be used to pair regions. So all of the region pairs, usually they are in the same geography. So they can be used that we can replicate data, create redundancy, but still maintain the same data residency and same compliance because we are usually in the same geography. Then we have, of course, the regions. In these regions, we have one or multiple data centers that are connected. And this is where the availability zones come into play. Of course, not all of the regions, not 100% of the regions do have this support for the availability zones, but most of them do. And then we have these different physical locations that can be used within a region, and again, an availability zone can contain multiple data centers, and they have now in the different availability zones completely different and independent powering, cooling, and networking, so that when one of these availability zones goes down, the entire region can still function because we have this physical isolation and also independent powering, cooling, and so on. This is why we have this support for availability zones as protection from an entire region going down. If we talk about the hierarchy within our Azure accounts, we have at the lowest level, of course, all of the resources. These are the instances of services like virtual machines or databases. They are always contained in a resource group. This is a layer of management, so we can store the resources in these resource groups. Then we have the subscriptions for billing purposes and the management groups as an additional management layer, which can be used for policies or also for security aspects to manage governance across subscriptions. That's what we've learned about the global infrastructure as well as the hierarchy in our Azure account.